The cold water closed over my head before I even understood what had happened. 1 second I was standing at the stern of the boat, watching the sun melt into the Adriatic. The next I was underwater, and the hull of the Serenova was sliding away from me in the dark. I didn't scream either. I don't know why. Maybe 63 years of running a business teaches you that the moment you panic is the moment you lose. Or maybe some part of me already knew, already understood in the 3 seconds before I hit the water, that my son-in-law's hand had been on my back. I surfaced once. I saw the boat. I saw 2 figures at the stern, my daughter and her husband, standing close together, not moving. Neither of them jumped in. I went under again. You need to understand something about me before any of this makes sense. I am not the kind of man who talks about himself easily. I spent 41 years building Callaway Marine Supply from a single warehouse in Pensacola, Florida, into a regional distribution network with contracts in 11 states. I drove the same truck for 9 years. I packed orders myself on nights when we were short-staffed. I did not take a vacation, a real one, more than 4 days, until my wife, Renata, made me swear on our 30th anniversary that I would. She died 4 years before I sold the company. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After that I kept working because I didn't know what else to do with myself. The work had always been there, and when the business wasn't there, I thought about Renata, and I couldn't breathe right. So I worked. The offer came from a logistics firm out of Atlanta. $94 million for the whole operation. The warehouses, the fleet, the contracts, the name. My attorney, a careful man named Hartwell who had been with me for 20 years, told me to sleep on it for a week before I said yes. I slept on it for 1 night. I was 62 years old. My knees hurt. My daughter, Mira, was married and living in Charleston. My son, who I'll come back to, lived 20 minutes from me and called once a month if I was lucky. I had more money than I would ever need and no one to share dinner with. I signed the papers on a Tuesday in April. The trip to Croatia was Mira's idea. She called me the week after the sale closed, almost giddy, which was unusual for Mira. She had always been the steadier of my 2 children, practical, direct. She told me she wanted to do something to celebrate, something real, not just dinner. She had been researching the Dalmatian coast for years, she said. Dubrovnik, the islands, the old walled city, all of it. She said, "Dad, you've been working your whole life. You sold the company. Let us take you somewhere. Let us." I remember the phrasing. Her husband, Donovan, had come into her life 3 years earlier. They met at a conference in Atlanta. He was in commercial real estate development. Mira was in financial planning. On paper, they made sense. In person, Donovan was the kind of man who made you feel like you were standing just outside the edge of a conversation he was having with himself. He smiled easily and said very little that meant anything. Renata had met him once, just a few months before she got sick. And afterward, alone in the kitchen after Mira and Donovan had gone home, she had said to me quietly, "Watch that one, Frank." She had called me Frank since the day we met. Nobody else called me that. My name is Francis. I should have listened to her the way I always listened to her. I just hadn't figured out yet what I was watching for. We flew into Dubrovnik on a Sunday in June. Business class because Mira insisted, which I protested and then didn't fight too hard. The city was exactly what she had promised. Ancient stone walls over a sea so blue it looked digitally altered, orange-roofed buildings stacked up the hillside, boats cutting white lines across the harbor. I stood on the balcony of our hotel the first evening and felt for the first time in a long time that something in my chest had loosened. Donovan was pleasant those first 2 days. That's the honest word for it. Pleasant. He asked about the business, about the sale, about whether I had spoken with an estate attorney yet. I told him Hartwell had referred me to a firm in Pensacola that specialized in estate planning. Donovan nodded and said something about how important it was to move quickly on those things, to make sure everything was structured correctly. I didn't think much of it. He was in finance-adjacent work. It was natural territory for him. The second time he brought it up was at dinner the following night. We were at a restaurant near the old city gate, good wine, the kind of slow evening Renata would have loved. Donovan mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he knew a firm in Charleston, boutique, very discreet. They handled UHNW clients, he said, which I had to ask him to translate. Ultra-high net worth individuals. He thought they might be worth a call. Mira changed the subject. I noticed that she changed it quickly. The third time was on the boat. We had chartered a day cruise on the third day, a mid-sized vessel, captain, and 1 deckhand included, nothing extravagant. We were visiting the island of Korčula in the morning and coming back along the coast by afternoon. The weather was perfect. The Adriatic in June is something I will never have adequate words for. We were heading back toward Dubrovnik, late afternoon. The sun was already starting to go orange and heavy at the western edge of the water. I was standing at the stern watching the wake, the way I used to stand at the end of the dock behind our first warehouse in Pensacola when I needed to think. Donovan came and stood beside me. He started slowly. He said it must be strange, after all those years, to suddenly have this much capital sitting still. Undeployed, he said. He used that word. He talked about fiduciary structures, about how the wrong estate setup could cost Mira. Not him. He was careful to say Mira, 60 or 70% of what I had built, between estate taxes and probate fees, if something happened to me before I had proper documentation in place. I said, I have a good attorney, Donovan. This is already being handled. He said, Hartwell isn't an estate specialist. You need someone who understands generational wealth transfer at this level. There was something in the way he said it, a tightness underneath the smooth surface of it, like he had practiced the sentence and the practice was almost invisible, but not quite. I turned to look at him. He smiled and nodded toward the water. He said, Come look at this view from the edge. You can see all the way back to the coast. I took 2 steps toward the railing. I felt his hand press flat against my upper back, and then it was falling. The water hit me like something solid. The Adriatic in June is warmer than the North Atlantic, but it is not warm. I went under and the cold pressed in from every direction, and I lost all sense of where the surface was for a moment. That felt much longer than it was. I had been a swimmer, high school, then recreational for decades. I coached my son's youth swim team for 3 summers when he was 9, 10, 11 years old. My body remembered something, even when my mind was still catching up to what had happened. I found the surface. The boat was already 20 feet away. The engine was not stopping. I saw Mira. She was at the stern rail, looking back at me. Her hands were on the rail, and she wasn't moving, and her face was, I don't have the right word. It was the face of someone watching something they had known was coming, and had told themselves they could live with, and were now discovering they couldn't. Donovan was beside her. He had his hand on her arm. I went under again. I am a 63-year-old man with arthritis in both hands and a knee that was scoped 18 months ago. But I came back up. I kept coming back up. The coast was visible in the distance and the current was not aggressive, and I am too stubborn, fundamentally, to drown. There was a wooden lobster boat, maybe 150 yards to my north. I started swimming toward it. The fisherman's name was Andre. He was 60-something himself, weathered and unhurried, and he pulled me over the side of his boat without ceremony, and handed me a towel and a thermos of coffee without asking a single question for the first 10 minutes. Then he looked at me steadily and said, in careful English, You want me to call the Coast Guard? I thought about Mira's face at the stern rail. I said, Not yet. Can you take me to shore? Andrzej brought me to a small harbor, south of Dubrovnik. I sat on a dock piling for a while, soaking wet in the early evening, and I tried to think clearly. Here is what I knew. I had $94 million. I was 63 years old. My son-in-law had pushed me off a boat, and my daughter had watched. Nobody had jumped in. Nobody had stopped the engine. Here is what I did not know. Whether Mira had known in advance. Whether this was something planned or something that had happened because Donovan was Donovan and saw an opportunity and took it. Whether the face I had seen at the stern rail was the face of someone who had agreed to this, or the face of someone who had just realized she had married a man capable of it and had not stopped him. I needed to know the difference. I borrowed Andre's phone. I called Hartwell. Hartwell had been my attorney for 20 years. He is not an excitable man. I told him as plainly as I could what had happened. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, Francis, are you physically safe right now? I said yes. He said, Don't contact Mira yet. Don't contact Donovan. Tell me where you are and don't move. This is the part of the story that people who haven't built a business sometimes find hard to understand. The discipline required to not act immediately. Every instinct I had said to call Mira, yell at her, demand to know why, drive to wherever they were and put the question directly to Donovan's face. I have made enough mistakes in my life to know that the immediate instinct is very rarely the right one. Hartwell worked. I waited. I stayed the first night in a small guest house near the harbor, paid in cash from the emergency money I keep in a waterproof wallet, a habit from 30 years of working on docks. I bought dry clothes from a shop near the waterfront. I ate something I couldn't taste. My phone, which had been in my breast pocket, was dead. That was fine. Being unreachable, I was beginning to understand, was useful information for me to have. The next morning Hartwell called me on the guest house phone. He had already spoken with 2 attorneys, one in Florida who handled estate law, one in Atlanta who handled financial crimes. He had also called a private investigator he used for corporate due diligence work. "Before you do anything else," he said, "we need to know what Donovan has already moved." What Donovan had moved, it turned out, was considerable. Over the following 8 days, while I stayed in a rented apartment in a coastal town, an hour from Dubrovnik, and Hartwell's people worked through the financial records available to them, a picture assembled itself. Donovan had been carrying roughly $2 million in personal debt from a commercial real estate development in South Carolina that had collapsed during COVID. He had structured the debt in ways that made it less visible, but not invisible to someone who knew where to look. He had also, Hartwell's investigator found, spent the 18 months before our Croatia trip quietly researching estate law and inheritance structures in Florida and South Carolina both. The first search, the investigator noted, was dated approximately 3 weeks after the news of my company sale had appeared in a Pensacola business journal. He had been planning this, not impulsively, not in the heat of a moment. He had looked at my $94 million and spent a year and a half mapping the route to it. When I understood that, something shifted in me. Not rage, I was past the initial rage by then, something colder and more useful. The same thing I had felt in 2009 when the recession nearly took the business, and I had sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the books in front of me and made myself look at exactly how bad it was so I could figure out precisely what to do about it. I called Hartwell and told him to begin the formal documentation of everything. Mira called me on the 5th day. She had been calling my dead cell phone, she said. She had called the hotel in Dubrovnik. Her voice on the guest house line was fractured, there's no other word, like something that had been held together by tension, and the tension had finally given. She said, "Dad," I said, "I'm here." She started crying, not performance crying. I know the difference after raising 2 children. This was the sound of someone who had been holding something terrible inside a closed space, and the door had finally opened. She told me what I had already suspected in the part of me that knew my daughter. Donovan had not discussed this with her in advance. He had told her, standing at the stern rail with her in the seconds after I went into the water, that I had lost my balance, that I had been leaning too far over the rail and my knee had given. She had watched the water where I went under, and Donovan had kept his hand on her arm. And she had told herself it was an accident, because the alternative was something she could not make herself believe in real time about the man she had married. She had convinced herself for 5 days. She hadn't called the Coast Guard. She hadn't filed a missing persons report. She had convinced herself. I sat with that for a while. I didn't tell her about the hand I had felt on my back. Not yet. I told her I was safe. I told her I needed a few more days. I told her I loved her. I said, "Don't tell Donovan you found me." There was a long pause. She said, "Okay." Hartwell's attorney in Florida filed the first legal document on day 9. A fraud action related to Donovan's misrepresentations about his financial situation prior to marriage. There were disclosures that could be challenged, conversations that Mira could, and ultimately did, testify to. That was the foundation. The estate attorney recommended a revocable living trust, structured to ensure that in the event of my death, the assets would pass through a framework that Donovan could not touch, regardless of his marital status with Mira. That was already in motion. The criminal referral to the Pensacola FBI field office, which had jurisdiction because the Offshore Act had involved an American citizen and the financial fraud predating it had crossed state lines, that came on day 11. I flew home on day 12. My son, and this is a thing I have not yet said, because it is its own complicated story, my son knew none of this was happening. We had not been close for many years. That is my fault, and his fault in roughly equal measure, and we had been slowly trying to fix it in the way that men my age and his age try to fix things. Carefully, a little at a time, without talking directly about what needed fixing. He called me on day 13, after Mira had apparently told him I had gone off the grid for a few days, for reasons she described only as personal. He said, "Dad, are you okay?" Something about hearing his voice caught me in a way I hadn't expected. I told him I was home, I was physically fine, and that there was something I needed to tell him in person. We had dinner the following night. I told him everything. He sat across the table from me for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Why didn't you call me?" I said, "I should have." He said, "Yeah, you should have." He was right. I had spent so many years managing things alone, the business, the grief, the daily weight of decisions, that had no one to share them with after Renata died, that the habit of doing it alone had become indistinguishable from choosing to do it alone. I hadn't even considered calling him. That was something I had to look at honestly. We stayed at the table for another 2 hours. It was the longest conversation we had had since his mother's funeral. Donovan was served with papers on a Tuesday morning in September, 14 weeks after Croatia. The FBI investigation was still ongoing at the point of this writing, and my attorney has advised me to say nothing specific about it. What I can tell you is that the civil fraud action is proceeding. What I can tell you is that the marital asset review, as part of Mira's divorce filing, which she made herself, without me asking, found the $2 million in hidden debt and a number of other things Donovan had not disclosed. He had come into my daughter's life as a man with a real estate portfolio and a salary and a pleasant smile. He was leaving it as a man whose financial architecture had been examined by 3 different attorneys across 2 states and found to be constructed almost entirely of borrowed time. He would not be touching the $94 million. He would not be touching anything that belonged to my daughter or to me. Whatever he had imagined standing at the stern of that boat with his hand on my back, it had not accounted for the fact that I had spent 41 years learning to read a bad balance sheet before it could kill me. Mira moved back to Pensacola for a while after she filed. She stayed in the house I had grown up in, which I still owned and had been renting to a family who had just moved out. She brought her 2 cats and a kitchen's worth of things from Charleston, and she made dinners on Sunday nights, and she and I sat together the way Renata and I used to sit, in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to explain themselves to each other. We talked about her mother a lot during those months, things I hadn't talked about with anyone. How Renata had been the one who understood the business in a way no employee ever had, not because she worked in it, but because she understood me. How she had said, "Watch that one," about Donovan, and I had filed it away, instead of asking her what she meant. Mira said, "She would have figured him out by Christmas." I said, "She would have figured him out before dessert." We both laughed. It was the kind of laughter that has some grief in it, but that's all right. That's what laughter is supposed to do sometimes. My son and I drive down to the Gulf Coast now on the first Sunday of every month. We don't always talk much. Sometimes we just sit near the water and drink coffee from a thermos and watch the pelicans work the surface. It is not a dramatic reconciliation. It is just 2 people showing up consistently, which is the only way I know to rebuild anything. I am still not a man who talks about himself easily. I have told this story exactly 3 times before writing it here, to Hartwell, to my son, and to Mira. I am telling it now because the thing I keep coming back to is not the boat, and not Donovan, and not the cold weight of the water. It's the moment I surfaced the first time and saw Mira's hands on the rail. I made a choice in that moment, underwater and disoriented and 63 years old with bad knees and the Atlantic pressing in on all sides, to find out who she was before I decided what she had done. That choice changed everything that came after. Not because it led to legal action, or because it protected my estate, or because it ultimately helped dismantle what Donovan had spent 1.5 years constructing. Because it gave Mira the chance to be who she actually was. She was the girl who had gone into the water after her brother when he fell off the dock at age 6, before I could get my boots off. She was the woman who had sat beside her mother's hospital bed for 11 days straight and read to her from the paperbacks Renata loved, even after Renata stopped being able to respond. She had made a catastrophic error in judgment about the man she married. She had made another one in the seconds after I went into the water, when shock and disbelief and the pressure of a practiced hand on her arm had made her stand still when she should have screamed. But she had not made a third one. When I called from the guest house phone, she had said okay. When the moment came to choose, she chose correctly. Some things are worth staying calm enough to find out. I run 3 miles every morning still, even with the knee. Renata always said I was too stubborn to slow down. She wasn't wrong about much.